Recording. Welcome everybody to this week's Zoom presentation by the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. Our guest this week is Dr. Peter Ottensmeyer, Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's a medical biophysicist with about 35 years of cancer research behind him. When he retired, he started looking into, just a moment, get that box out of the way. Wow, how did that happen? He started looking into how we might go about eliminating nuclear waste. And the main topic today is going to be how can we increase the quantities of non-carbon energy that we have available for use in modern society. And the presentation is going to be followed by a question and answer period as usual. So Dr. Ottensmeyer, welcome very much to this week's session of the Club of Rome. And we look forward to your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Dave, and thank you for the invitation to talk to the Club of Rome. I had to actually look up what the Club of Rome was and what its raison d'etre was, and there seem to be two aspects. One is to alert the powers that be to the dangers facing the world on its present course, and second, to encourage corrective measures. Now, I looked at and listened to a good number of talks, and it seems that the emphasis is more on number one. Adam Finnick just last week talked about climate change and says we're screwed, there's nothing we can do about it. That seems rather dire. And Ruben Nelson, about a year ago, I think, talked about civilization overshoot, and the path that we're on is literally path to death of the world as we know it. Bill Rees, maybe about a month or so ago, talked about something similar, about civilization being the death of us. And so I think I'm there as a foil, really, because I'm supposed to talk about number two, and I want to talk about number two to encourage corrective measures. Fast spectrum SMR technology is sort of a neat way to get into it gently and to combat climate change in a massive way. And I would say, picking up on Bill Rees, that it's a quantitative substitute for fossil energy, except Bill Rees had already said, well, a quantitative substitute for fossil energy will simply deplete the planet. And I think he meant of other resources. And so even that was turned into a negative. So perhaps I can ask Bill that what I can offer is time, perhaps centuries of time where we as a mankind can gather some wisdom before we die. So the outline of my talk is really sort of talking about uranium, perhaps in a different way than you imagined, and about energy, because energy permits us to do things. And I've looked at energy really in three ways, in three eras or ages over the last 4.5 million years. There's the past, which was carbon neutral. And then for two centuries, we've really dug into fossil carbon. And hopefully the future will be relatively carbon free. And SMRs, small modular reactors, and nuclear energy, I think, is the way to go to handle all of those problems. And I'll talk about slow neutrons and fast neutrons. What makes it possible really is what we call nuclear fuel waste. If we recycle it, it gives us a tremendous amount of energy. Now, since some of it may be technical, I thought I'd start out with giving you the take-home message right away so that you can sign off and still have this ringing in your ears. You may or may not know that nuclear energy is really sort of non-carbon energy, or very low carbon, non-carbon if you've already dug the uranium out of the ground, because all you're doing is putting it into a reactor and creating energy, and there's no carbon involved. Now we've got 60,000 tons of nuclear fuel, used nuclear fuel, commonly called waste. but it's still 99.26% fuel, because we've only used about 3/4 of it to extract energy. Now, in some fast spectrum reactors, including SMRs, we can use the rest of it. And that helps us create about over 5,000 years of non-carbon energy at the current nuclear power levels that we're using in Canada. And that avoids emitting 560 billion tons of CO2. Now, if you don't know how much that is, about 3 trillion tons of CO2 are in the atmosphere. So this is about 18% of the CO2 just in the Canadian nuclear waste alone. Now, if we want to increase our power levels, then to replace, say, fossil energy in Ontario, we can do that for about 800 years. And if we want to tackle all of Canada with that nuclear waste, then we can replace Canada's fossil energy for about 300 years. I think that's worthwhile going after. And the lovely thing is that the technology exists, has actually existed since 1951. The first electricity ever produced by nuclear power was in one of these types of reactors. And we've already accumulated $10 billion worth for nuclear waste management, which we can use as starting funds to go in this direction. So it's possible. But let me start at the very beginning. About 4.5 billion years ago, when the Earth was formed from the fragments of some supernova explosion that sent bits and pieces of itself through space and it glommed together to create the Earth. Now those rocks crushed together and created a tremendous amount of heat in the process. And so that the center of the Earth now is actually at 500 degrees, but it's still solid because the pressure is so great. It's surrounded by a ring of liquid of iron and nickel. And then beyond that, we've got rock. And the temperature, of course, increases towards the outside, and it's about a lovely 15 degrees, which is good for life on the surface. But the Earth emits that energy, that heat into space. And if it weren't for the sun, we would have sort of an icy surface. But even the sun is not enough. And what keeps it at that Goldilocks temperature really is the decay of uranium-238 and a bit of U-235 and so forth. I'll just move your picture away so I can see what I'm doing. That decay emits an alpha particle, which is really nothing more than a helium nucleus, like in kids' toys. And it emits about 3.3 million electron volts. Now, to compare that, a carbon combining with oxygen to give you heat gives you about 5 electron volts. So this is 1 million times more than that. So it's a tremendous amount of heat. And even the 4 parts per million in the crust is sufficient to do that. Now, uranium is not alone, because in doing that, it becomes thorium, and then it becomes protactinium, and then uranium again at a smaller version, thorium and radium and radon, and so forth. It goes all the way to lead, which is stable, and emitting energy all the way along. It doesn't do that immediately. It takes about 300,000 years, because there are some real laggards in there. The uranium and the thorium-230 together require about 300,000 years before this moves on. And so a single uranium disintegrating into something smaller takes about 300,000 years to become lead. And that's been happening for 4.5 million years. Now, each of these, as they decay, also emit energy. And so altogether, we've got enough energy to keep the Earth warm and livable. And that's uranium. And if you think of geothermal heat, that's uranium as well. It's this chain here that gives you the geothermal heat. So it's radioactivity, you might say. Now, in the middle, of course, there's radon, and say, oh, radon, that's dangerous. It's in our basement and so forth in our houses. Well, it's been there for about 4.2 billion years. And we've evolved in that radioactivity, in the sea of radioactivity. And we've evolved defense mechanisms that keep us alive, because obviously we are alive today. Now, if we look at it as a physicist, then today is right there. And then going backwards, the Earth was formed 4.5 million years ago. The uranium-238 that we have now is about 99% U-238 in the total uranium and about 1% U-235. And 4.5 million years ago, that's a half-life of U-238. There was twice as much there. So over the time, we've lost half of the uranium. And of course, it's going to be half again in another 4.5 million years. But that was enough heat to evolve life. Life evolved about a billion years after the Earth formed. And we've got evidence of that in rocks near the ocean. Australia, for instance, Shark Bay is a good place. And it's sort of like corals that have grown, because it comes in layers and layers and layers of cells that glomp together to form, like I say, something like corals. Mankind actually is a rather recent arrival, because we evolved into something called man just fairly recently on this time scale. And so you might say our existence is due to those lovely conditions that uranium caused on the surface of the Earth. Now, energy helped us evolve, obviously, and energy also makes life better, because the more energy we use, and this is data from the United Nations, of different nations, the more energy we use, the more we can spend, and therefore the higher is our so-called standard of living. India's down there, US is up there, and it changes with time. Here are some nations, Bangladesh and Malaysia and Singapore and so forth, which in 20 years increased their use of energy and increased their so-called standard of living for each of them. And even the USA improved in 20 years there for between 1980 and 2000. But that's been happening for eons. And our good man here, all he had really was his muscle energy to start with. But he also had a brain, and that brain evolved tools, and his standard of living went up because of it. But then he realized that if he multiplied his muscle by using animals, his standard of living would increase again. And when we invented machines like ramps and levers and wheels and wagons and gears and winches and blocks and tackles, our standard of living just soared. I like blocks and tackles because I'm sort of a nautical person. Because it let us build ships and windmills and water wheels, and life just became lovely. I mean, it's almost nostalgic when you see these sailing vessels there using wind power. Well, it was dangerous, but windmills have been around for a good long time, and we're trying to go back into that with we call them now turbines, and water wheels are just lovely to play with as well, play around, and they gave us our motive power, and that was all in the what I call the carbon neutral era. And that ended somewhere around 1500 to 1800, because somebody used their brains in Spain, Geronimo de Ayance and James Watt in England, to invent the steam engine. And that changed our life. Not only, wood wasn't good enough, we used coal and oil and natural gas and so forth, and we conquered the world on land. it went faster. We invented the internal combustion engine and the jet turbine and so forth, and we flew into the air. That's the Concorde, if you remember that far back. And you figure when we invented electric motors, then things should get better. Well, you know, a little bit if we use hydropower, but most people don't have hydropower, and so they create electricity with coal and oil and natural gas. And all of that, of course, emits carbon dioxide. How much have we emitted into the atmosphere since the 1800s, since James Watt's invention? Well, there are tables that you can look up for each country and so forth. And the world altogether by now emits about 35 billion tons per year of CO2 into the atmosphere. And altogether, since the 1800s, we've emitted about close to 2 trillion tons of CO2. Now, is that a lot? Well, in 1800, the entire CO2 content in the atmosphere was about 2 trillion tons. By 2020, it was 3.1 trillion tons. You figure, well, it should be 4. Well, the rest of it went into the ocean and acidified the ocean. And so we started thinking about that and wondered whether it had ever happened before. Well, obviously there were some sort of natural phenomena where the CO2 went up and down and the temperature sort of followed in concert, but nothing has happened that's as drastic as what's happened recently. And so instead of Homo sapiens, which arrived somewhere around 200,000 years ago, now we've got maybe Homo insapiens, or if we want to be kind, we'll call him Homo carbutylus, like carbon user. But the consequence of that, is obviously going to be a rise of temperature as well. And this was zeroed at 1960, so it was below that in the 1900s, and it's now 1.2 degrees above that. So things are warming up, and obviously we've got the heat waves that show us that yes, it is. And so the thought was, we've got to do something. And the Germans invented this word, Energiewende, or energy transition. And you think that Angela Merkel was the instigator of this. Well, it actually happened 30 years before her. She called it Energiekonzept. And the idea was that you would do away with carbon, but really the German population was really after doing away with nuclear. And so in the process, they've been spending about 35 billion euros per year over the last 10 years. And the effect was to lower their carbon emissions for electricity from about 500 grams per of CO2 to about 400. Ontario, in the meantime, is down to 31 grams per kilowatt hour. So we're doing rather well, and we do that primarily on the basis of nuclear fission. 60% of our electricity comes from nuclear fission from our reactors. Now, nuclear fission is a relative new phenomenon on the greater scheme of things on that geological timescale. It started in 1938 when Otto Hahn and Lisa Meitner and Fritz Strassner and Otto Frisch, a relative of Meitner, found that what they had done in the lab was split an atom, a uranium atom. And you say, oh, that's nuclear physics. I can't understand that. Well, if you've ever played pool, then you know half of nuclear physics right there. Because you slam this white ball, which is called a neutron in nuclear physics, into an atom, a large atom, and you have to be rather skilled on the table here to get it to break in such a way that you've got 2 nice clusters there, and then 2 more white balls or 3 fly off as neutrons into the district. Well, in the nuclear reactor core, that's exactly what happens, except it's a three-dimensional pool. And so the neutron slams into, say, a uranium atom, and it splits that atom, and out come two smaller atoms. I've called them krypton and barium here. That's approximately right. And they fly apart. And they fly apart with the order of 90 mega electron volts. And this event, even though it sounds like it's a lot, it still takes about 150 billion of these events to give you 1 calorie of energy, which if you remember from your high school days means that it can heat 1 centimeter cubed of water 1 degree Celsius, okay? So a single fission is a tiny amount of energy. And that's nuclear energy. And what is nuclear energy? Well, it's really the energy that's stored, but it ends up being kinetic energy when these things fly apart with tremendous speeds, the order of 12,000 kilometers per second. But they're so large, they don't go very far because they're inside a crystal. And so they bump into atoms and they give that energy off as heat, vibration of those atoms. And that's what we use. We usually use a slow neutron here to do this, but out come actually fast neutrons. Now the slow neutron is still rather speedy at 1 kilometers per second. That's 3,600 kilometers per hour. And the fast neutrons are about 10,000 times faster. So they zip along at a fair speed. Now, I should say that not all uranium atoms are equal. There are different so-called isotopes, which all have the same number of protons that makes it that kind of atom and different numbers of neutrons. Now, uranium is 1% U-235 and 99% U-238. And that has consequences because in a reactor, U-235 splits very easily to yield energy and more neutrons. And that keeps the reaction going. And this is usually called fuel. U-238, even though it's 99% of the thing, does not split, but changes to uranium-239 when it absorbs a neutron. And it's kind of uncomfortable as a nucleus and jiggles and spits out a couple of electrons and becomes plutonium-239 in about 3 days. Now that's useful because plutonium-239 splits just like U-235 in the reactor to yield energy and neutrons. And so that's also fuel. And at the end of a run in a CANDU reactor, we get about half of the energy from plutonium-239 as we do from uranium-235. Now, the problem, of course, for an engineer is that all atoms in the entire structure absorb neutrons. And so that one has to be wise in how to construct these reactors to use the neutrons efficiently. And people do that in many, many different ways. And here are sort of 9 examples of these smaller reactors, including a small CANDU reactor up in the corner. And some of them use slow neutrons, which are also called thermal neutrons, and some use fast neutrons. And those are the ones I'm mostly interested in. Now, if we look at a reactor, it's really a very, very simple device. It's a barrel full of water, which has tubes in them which contain the fuel. And so if we look at this, it's surrounded here by a protective shield so that airplanes don't fly into the thing. But otherwise, it just makes it look pretty. But it's a heater. That's all it is. It creates heat, and that heat creates steam, which creates electricity. End of story, you might say. Here you see the tubes there, and these tubes here are big enough that they take CANDU fuel bundles. Now, CANDU fuel bundles is one of these tubes which contain pellets of uranium, and it's handled by a person because it's not very radioactive. He's got gloves on because he doesn't want the the carbon in his sweat to end up in the reactor, because the carbon 12, the normal carbon, turns into carbon 14, which becomes radioactive. So you got to keep it clean. But that gets put into the reactor like that with a fueling machine, and then we close the tubes and put water through them, and the water heats up and becomes so hot that it can create steam in a steam generator, which then turns the turbine and creates electricity. It's a very simple device, but we want to really look at how to use that uranium better. And so we're going to look at the fuel bundle and take out one of the pellets, and it looks roughly like that. It's not quite as long. Here's a real picture of it. And it says that about 6 to 8 of these pellets contain enough energy to cover the electricity needs for an average household for a year. Now that's in normal reactors. In the fast neutron reactors, you can multiply that by energy yield by about 100. So that you might say these 6 or 8 pellets take care of the electricity needs for about 100 years. That's a tremendous amount of energy. And it all comes really from the fissioning of, I'm going to show you some uranium atom images from an electron microscope. And it's been enlarged to such an extent that, this distance here is about 100 times smaller than a human hair. It's called 1 nanometer or 10 angstroms. And the brighter image here, slightly distorted because we don't have a perfect lens to image, is a uranium atom. And this is an oxygen atom, except it's 2 of them, one on over top of the other. But we're interested in the nucleus, and the nucleus is about 20,000 times smaller than this entire atom. And so we can't take a picture, but here is a representation of this nucleus, which of course is in the atom that's in the fuel. So here is the fuel again, and it's filled entirely with these atoms. And I've shoved all of the uranium-235 atoms up into the upper corner. They're of course spread throughout this. And in a conventional reactor, we use slow neutrons because slow neutrons look at U-238 and they think it's a big balloon. And so they find that much more efficiently to split than they look at the U-238 that's in there. So the neutron, while we see this, the neutron really sees that thing like this, where about out of 100 neutrons, 55 will fission that little bit of uranium that's up in the uranium-235 that's in the upper corner. And another 10% are just absorbed as the U-235 becomes U-236. And the rest of it, the neutrons are absorbed in U-238, which eventually becomes plutonium-239, which then acts like additional fuel, which is great. Now, the CANDU reactor uses about 3/4 of the fuel amount that's in the uranium. Are other reactors better than the CANDUs? CANDUs use heavy water because heavy water doesn't absorb neutrons very well. Most of the world uses light water reactors, which does absorb neutrons, and they compensate for that by having to enrich the U-235, give it more, give the neutrons more U-235 to hit because there are fewer neutrons because some gets absorbed by the water. So instead of only having 1% U-235, you have about 3 to 5%. I've used 4 here. And those neutrons, slow neutrons, now look at this 4% U-235, and they say, hey, this is really terrific. About 75% of the neutrons fission, but we've got fewer neutrons to fission. And so they still produce enough neutrons to keep the reactors going. But now the U-238 only gets converted to plutonium to about 11%. So it's basically the fuel here is much more just plain U-235. And that's 1% in mined uranium. And that's serious because in the other reactors, other than CANDU's, only 0.5% of the total mined uranium is actually consumed. And according to the World Nuclear Association, the Canadian uranium reserves will run out by 2050 because of this inefficient use. The reactors just say, give me uranium and I will use less than 1% of the rest and I'll throw the rest away. This seems like a terrible way of doing it. And even though we have potentially up to 500,000 tons of uranium, we're mining and exporting it at about 12,000 tons per year. And three years in a row, we had 16,000 tons per year. And that basically means that this will only last the order of 30 years before we run out, even for CANDU reactors. That's the year 2050. I won't quite live that long, but certainly my kids and my grandchildren will. And so is that the end of nuclear power? You say, well, what about the rest of the world? Well, if you take all of the world's economical reserves, they will be similarly exhausted by about 2090. That's a bit better, but still, it's not very satisfactory. So you might say that that's my part one of the Club of Rome raison d'etre. But there is a solution. We can use fast neutron reactors and fuel recycling. And there, amongst these small modular reactors, there are some which are fast neutron reactors. This one here, which is, oops, go back, the version from Moltex, which is undergoing a change in design at the moment, so I really can't say very much about it. And there's this one here, Advanced Reactor Concepts, I misspelled it, should be ARC. And there's the Prism by GE Hitachi. Those are the fast neutron reactors. Now, fast neutrons don't interact with U-235 very efficiently, and so we need to increase that concentration for them to work. But the lovely thing is that they then interact with uranium-238 to about 50% of the time, which means that while we get enough neutrons and energy out of this, for every uranium-235 atom that's used, one of these U-238 is converted into U-239, and that becomes fuel and replaces that. And so effectively, well, we're just taking U-235, 238 and putting it into fuel and then creating energy from that. And you say, well, why don't we start with plutonium-239 to start with? Because we can do that. And where do we get it? Well, we can get that from concentrating CANDU fuel waste because it has plutonium in it that we can use as starting fuel in this scheme. If we start out that way, then essentially we can even convert more of the U-238 into plutonium-239, which also goes into plutonium-240 and 241 and 242 and so forth, because you're probably going to ask me about plutonium. And here, this process is actually even more efficient in terms of converting this plutonium-239 into energy, while at the same time the U-238 replenishes that plutonium-239, and even the rest of the plutonium replenishes and creates more plutonium-239 and other plutoniums that we can use even in other reactors. Now, in terms of using U-235, Canada has no U-235 enrichment facilities. The only countries really that have them to a large extent are countries that build atom bombs. Canada has decided not to do that. But we do have plutonium as a mixture with other heavy atoms in our fuel. And our 60,000 tons of CANDU fuel provides about 240 tons of useful starting material to start about 24,000 megawatts of reactors. That's about more than 2.5 times the nuclear power that we have currently. So that's a tremendous amount of starting fuel. And if we take this material is actually the long-lived worry in nuclear fuel waste. It's radiotoxic for close to 1 million years. But if we take this out and put it into these reactors and consume it, it's gone. And so this approach actually eliminates the long-term million-year radiotoxicity of our stored used CANDU fuel in our stockpiles. So I just love that aspect of it. We get energy and we eliminate the radiotoxicity. Now, I've said that recycling maintains the fissile component, and I indicated how that's maintained by changing the U-238 into fissile components or splittable components. And it permits fueling with U-238, which is the basic starting fuel then, for many centuries. Now, what does many centuries mean? Well, our 60,000 tons of used CANDU fuel took about 40 years to accumulate. And during those 40 years, on the average, we created about 10,000 megawatts of power. And we've only used less than 1% of this fuel. And the rest is 99.26% is left. And that can be used in fast neutron reactors and used completely. And so you might say, we still have a potential of 0.9926 divided by this 0.74, which is 134 times more energy. And since we accumulated that in 40 years, we have enough to this power level to last us 134 times 40 years, which is over 5,000 years at this power level. This is huge. Now, I won't go into reuse and recycle, except to give you some idea of costs, which are on the right-hand side in the next slide. There are different ways that you can recycle. Purex is one of them. Pyroprocessing is another. Fluoride volatility methods, and they have different costs. Purex is the most expensive and also the most messy. Pyroprocessing is very clean, and fluoride volatility is about the same price. Now, how does one compare that to actually just getting rid of the fuel bundle by burying it? Because also that costs money. We've been paying from our electricity bill into the fund to do that. And by now we've got about $10 billion in that fund. And that's from about 2.8 million bundles of used fuel. So per fuel bundle, we've got funds that are about $3,600 just to bury it, to get rid of it. This huge energy resource. And that's about 3 times more expensive than actually processing it using pyroprocessing or fluoride volatility. And you say, well, but is it economical even then to make new fuel? Well, we can buy new fuel from the United States if we buy enriched U-235. And say for one of these reactors at 300 megawatts, it needs a total charge of 20 tons, of which 4 tons are these transuranics, which is plutonium, neptunium, americium, and so forth as a mixture. And that, instead of using that, we use U-235 and it costs us $150 million. If we use pyroprocessing, we can produce the same fuel for these reactors for less than half that price. And so it's economically viable to do that. So let me summarize and give you the benefits of recycling used CANDU fuel through fast neutron reactors. It gives us centuries of massive non-carbon energy from the 60,000 tons of used fuel that we've got sitting there. We don't have to mine it even. And it avoids CO2 emissions equal to about 20% almost of all of the CO2 in the atmosphere. That's useful. It increases our uranium resource by the order of 130 times. And it eliminates the million-year radiotoxic hazard from used fuel. It's long-term fuel security, and it's indigenous. It's our own. We don't have to buy it from anyone. So that if somebody like Trump comes along and says U-235 is a strategic material, I won't sell it to you. Well, we can say, well, we've got our own. We don't need U-235. And if you extend that to the globe, by now we've got about almost 3 million tons of already mined uranium that's sitting there as used uranium and depleted uranium. That's enough using this approach to create $300,000 worth of non-carbon electricity for every person on Earth, man, woman, child, and baby. That's tremendous. And if we go in that direction, that would avoid CO2 emissions equal to 7 times all of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere now. So we can think of actually perhaps using some of this energy to get some of the carbon dioxide out. It's there for our taking. So what do we need for this? Well, we need a reactor that works with a spectrum of fast neutrons. Slow neutrons just will not do this. You need some reactors which have a sort of what's called in the jargon a conversion ratio of 1, which means that for every fuel atom that you use and split, you create another one in the process from U-238. And the fuel form that we have to use should permit easy recycling. Whatever you use, combine it with a recycling method that gives you a minimum of extraneous processing waste, because you don't want to create more problems than you're solving. And you say, is this sort of pie in the sky? Well, no, it's not, because these fast spectrum reactors exist, and they have a fuel form. For instance, the methyl fuel form that's enriched with transuranics. That's the plutonium, neptunium, americium, and so forth. And the prism-like reactor from GE Hitachi will do, and the arc-like reactor from Advanced Reactor Concepts, the company. And you couple that with electrometallurgical fuel refining, because the used metal fuel rod can be an anode. You put it into a vat of electrolyte, and you refine it out, and you get pure metal out at the other end as a cathode. So that process has been used, it exists, and so that, like I say, it's not pie in the sky. Now I can tell you a whole lot more, but maybe you can ask questions, because I thank you for inviting me, and hopefully some of you are left, other than David, whose picture I see constantly here anyway. So at least I got one in the audience. Thank you, David.
Well, that was fascinating. And I will tell you, you've got 100% of the people who started still with us. It's just a fascinating review of the background to modern civilization, a very clear explanation of the nuclear physics involved. I was fascinated and rapt to hear it all. I'm going to reserve the first question for myself, and Art Hunter is on deck. Here's my first question. If modern societies collapse in the face of climate change, they may not be able to maintain the cooling and security of nuclear facilities. The result could be disastrous fires and or explosions similar to what was seen at Fukushima. To what extent could such events be avoided if we deploy fleets of small nuclear reactors of the type you've been describing?
Well, I mean, it's a challenging question. And what comes to mind is really an experiment that was done with a reactor called the EBR-2 in around 1986, I think it was, just before the Chernobyl disaster. And there, what they did was essentially have the reactor run at full power, and they cut off the cooling. And this reactor, which is metal cooled, with liquid metal, you're probably familiar with liquid solder, so it's a similar type of thing. And it's got metal fuel rods, and the metal, the entire reactor core heated up, the metal expanded. And since the reaction is so finely balanced, the expansion of the atoms away from each other meant that the neutrons could not find as many atoms, and actually some of them started escaping from the reactor. And so the reactor heated up, expanded, and the reaction stopped automatically. So that it's kind of amazing. I don't think the experiment has been done with any other type of reactor. So it's the type of reactor that we want to use, which essentially shuts itself down. You might say the CANDU reactor is hard to keep up running anyway, and so that whatever you do, it'll shut itself down. But this one intrinsically, without any motive power, they actually eliminated the motion to the control rods before they did this experiment, and just then stopped the cooling pumps, stopped the circulation, and the reactor shut itself down in 5 minutes. It took about a minute to increase the temperature, and as a result of the physics, it then shut itself down. So you might say if it then keeps on cooling, eventually it'll become solid. So it'll incorporate and maintain things there as a solid if it's done right. Hopefully you won't have people running away that quickly, and that you'll have some intelligence left that sort of makes sure that, yes, you put in some control rods to shut it down.
Great, thank you. So Art Hunter has got the next question, and John Legg is on deck.
Peter, I listened to you, and I'm just blown away by how much common sense this makes. I guess I say, why isn't this happening everywhere? Why is there some resistance? What's the issue here? But I'll turn this into a question that's perhaps a little more understandable. What is the status to date of development of a proof of concept device to verify that this is economically viable? I presume that's what's slowing everyone from signing up to it. Or is there safety issues? Are there other things that are involved there? And in any event, where are we with regards to development of a commercial unit?
Let me pick up a little earlier because everyone says, why aren't we doing this? Well, the normal reactors really are very safe already, and they're working very well. And they've produced a tremendous amount of energy. So you might say, why change? And change for reactors, a new direction is economically sensitive. And this is where the small reactors perhaps now permit us to finally change from what was working very well into something that is going to work even better. Because you can put those in piecemeal at chunks of money that you can digest, whereas big reactors cost so much that people just say, well, that's just too plain expensive. If you actually go per megawatt output, then a nuclear reactor is about the same as a windmill, a wind turbine. It's just that it's 1,000 wind turbines all at once rather than one at a piece. Now, small modular reactors, say at 100 megawatts, are still 300 wind turbines altogether. But that you might be able to manage, because that's sort of one wind farm, you might say. Now, how are we doing with respect to that? The feasibility, of course, was shown already in the United States with their fast neutron reactors. Russia has commercial reactors of size from 50 megawatts to 800 megawatts, and they're thinking of a 1,600 megawatt reactor that they're building. But if we look at Canada, we are actually in the process of looking very seriously at some of these fast neutron reactors in New Brunswick. New Brunswick Power is looking at two types, which were on my slide. One of them is the ARC 100. The other one is called Moltex SSRW, stable salt reactor for waste burning. For the, you try to take advantage of any language that you can get. And anyway, and they've put money into that. The province has, the companies have, to the tune of $10 million, and the federal government just added over $50 million in that direction. And so they're very seriously looking at this, and I would say they're going to succeed. They have to work a little harder at recycling, because companies would rather just have you put fuel into the reactor and then they walk away, rather than having the entire concept of reactor and recycling in one. Now, GE Hitachi, with their PRISM reactor, actually has a concept where they have 6 of these reactors in association with a recycling plant right on the facility. And so they're actually thinking more comprehensively, but it's there. I hope that answers some of your question.
Yes, thank you.
Great. So now over to John Legg, and Barry Bruce is on deck.
Thank you, Dave and Peter, for that excellent presentation. My questions are, I would say, very large scale ones. Well, in fact, they both have to do with scale. One is the security side, and the other is the, if one had a large number of small reactors, the distance question would come into play as well. Now, having to do with the security, we know that Pickering and Bruce, the large reactors, they have to supply security. And I would assume, and here you certainly don't need to go into detail, because I find it's probably such an ignorant question that you can blast it out of the water quickly, but it's up to you how you do it. The point is that a large reactor has a whole bunch of fixed security matters, plus cameras, et cetera, but then if you have a multitude of SMR, small modular reactors, don't you get into as well questions of security? And then you will be multiplying them by the number of these small reactors. What do you do about security? Don't you just face security in another, the problem of security in another form? that's the first question. So that's that. And then on the distance side, we know from the basic electricity, if you get into long distance transmission, of course, then you do get into losses and so on. But again, you're simply, it seems to me, if you get into a bunch of smaller reactors, you really do get into what is labeled is labeled distribution at the smaller voltage. So are you not simply replacing one form of cost by another? So there we are. There's a question of scale for both the security aspect and the distance of transmission aspect.
Well, the security aspect, I find really a sort of a sad tale, because you probably and I went visiting through these reactors and went right into the facilities some years ago, a good number of decades. And then somebody spoiled it for us because, and if I look at it in terms of the small scale of a small reactor, we actually have small reactors sprinkled through Canada that are working. They're at universities. U of T used to have one right on campus. McMaster does right on campus. The Royal Military College has a reactor. I think there was one in Alberta and in Saskatchewan and so forth. And you might say they don't have soldiers and policemen all around that I was aware of. And so, in a normal world, you don't need that sort of thing. It's just that, somebody wants to break in and do something. Well, a lot of these radioactive things are to some extent self-protecting. Because you can't just carry radioactivity away because it'll kill you if you get close enough. And so I really don't have an answer for that, because it's a psychological problem, I think, rather than a real physics problem. And it's a societal approach that we have to take. We either survive using clean energy or we die. And if they want to kill themselves getting into these reactors, well, maybe we should let them. But that's you might say that's not a very satisfactory answer. I really don't have an answer for you that I would say, well, we do this and this and this and this.
Okay.
Because
you want to make a quick comment on the second part of the question? And
sorry,
we should move on. We got about 8 people.
With respect to distances, well, you see, these reactors normally are thought of creating electricity, but what they do is create heat. And if you distribute them, then I think we all have a glorious opportunity also to use the heat portion of nuclear energy rather than just the electricity. Mm-hmm. And the heat you cannot transport very far. And so to use that, you have to be near the reactor, say within 10 kilometers or 20. Bruce Power actually did that once upon a time, until somebody said, "Oh, but this water comes from a nuclear reactor." Well, it doesn't. It was just heated by a nuclear reactor, right. So it was shut down. But it was actually working quite well for years.
Seems to link into a discussion that we had at one point about district energy systems.
That's exactly right.
Okay, I'd like to close it off there. We're going to move to Barry Bruce, and Bill Tyson's on deck.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ottensmeyer. that's exciting. And what I'd like to just put out there is that it's probably not, it's a necessary, I think, but maybe not sufficient solution to just eliminate fossil fuel use. I think we do have to remember that if we did nothing else, what this could, as an unintended consequence, result in higher populations that will consume yet more food and more land and more resources from the sea. So we still have the problem remaining of overuse, overpopulation, overuse of oceans, high population, agriculture, loss of carbon sinks in the soil. I just wanted to put it out there without diminishing what you said. I think it's very, very exciting, and I've always liked the possibility of compact energy sources like this, rather than filling our landscape with other things like windmills. So I'll just stop there and see what your response is, or anybody else's.
Well, I would say that I am a perennial optimist because I spend a life in research, and unless you're an optimist, you might as well get out of it, because most of the stuff that you do fails. And so you have to pick yourself up and you figure that the next time it's going to work. Now, you are probably also aware that as you raise the standard of living of various countries, the number of children that are born per couple decreases to such an extent that some countries actually are declining in population. And this is why I mentioned that if we use the existing 3 million tons of uranium that we've already mined, it will create $300,000 worth of electricity, which I mean as an example of energy, for every person on Earth. And so we can actually intervene and raise the standard of living, because the more energy you use, the higher your standard of living is going to be. And that will, in my Pollyannic approach, reduce the population.
Yeah, I
Does
think
that solve your problem?
In the process of improving the standard of living, I think that will work as long as you improve the status of women and
Look,
and
I don't know, I've got
education.
lots of daughters and granddaughters and so forth. So I am all for improving the status of women.
Yeah.
We have a lot of problems to address. Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on to Bill Tyson, and Ted Manning's on deck.
Hi, Peter. That was an excellent presentation, very optimistic and encouraging. I wonder if you would care to comment on thorium as a fuel.
Well, thorium, as you probably know, can't be used in a reactor at all by itself. It is very similar to uranium-238. It has to be converted into fuel. And so thorium has to be used in association with a fissile material, which you can indirectly get from thorium if you use, say, plutonium or uranium-235 to stimulate that transition. And then thorium is great because it is like U-235. It contains per atom exactly the same amount of energy. And so once we get to a state where we've got enough fissile material and maintain that in some of these fast reactors, thorium will work as a basic substance that gives you energy. But you can't do it without, first of all, changing the thorium into something useful.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So Ted Manning, followed by Bob Walker.
I'm going to change directions on you completely because
Okay,
it
I'll turn
strikes
around.
me that society is ill prepared to deal with anything that it perceives as dangerous. And of course, they made a real mistake when they named nuclear in the first place after a bomb, or at least allowed them to be associated. So I guess I'm really asking the question. I'm very impressed with the positive steps in different kinds of nuclear fuel, ways of handling them, ways of reducing risk. How the hell are we going to convince the public to let it happen in their block or in their town?
Well, we have to start someplace. And the place to start, I suppose, is in towns that are associated with nuclear energy already. And then sort of spread from there. Because
So do you have success stories to show them?
well, I mean, if you look at surveys that are done as to whether somebody is happy with nuclear or not, the closer you get to a place that has a nuclear reactor in it, the higher the numbers are. Whereas somebody, out in Timbuktu says, "Oh, nuclear must be dangerous," I say, well, then you better stop sleeping with your wife because your wife is radioactive.
She may be nuclear. Oh. Okay, thank
Well,
you very much, Peter. That was interesting.
basically, if you stop eating vegetables, you die.
Yeah.
Vegetables have potassium in them. Potassium is radioactive, has been since the stars were born.
Yeah.
And so we are radioactive. And so, and yet we survive.
Thank you very much. Good answer.
Okay, over to Bob Walker for a comment, and we're going to go to John Meyer, who's on deck.
Yeah, and again, thank you, Peter, for raising this so eloquently. I thought I'd just make a few comments to the question of, so why isn't this happening already? And refer back to the presentation I made to the club back in December, and that it is beginning to happen. I mean, Canada has an SMR roadmap and now an action plan, and the reactor types that Peter talked about are in the process of being deployed. There'll be demonstration. The challenge is that by 2050, we probably need globally at least 10,000 of these to be making the kind of impacts in carbon emissions we need to. So how do you get there? And the comment I make is that there's right now within the vendor community with these new technologies, there tends to be two schools. And the one school is the fast reactor community and reprocess the fuel. And it deals with all of the great needs that Peter's highlighting. There is another school that says, let's keep it with thermal neutron reactors and just go to a more robust fuel type. That's this so-called triso fuel that coats the uranium pellets with ceramic that makes it very, very difficult to melt. And it basically contains the fission products and actinides for hundreds of thousands of years. So you still bury it, but it's just much more accident resistant. And so there's two schools of thought. They both tend to play into the social license issue by saying, well, even if you've got waste, it's safer to deal with. But my concern, and this is where Peter's message needs to get out, and where bodies like the Club of Rome can help, is that the most important strategic choice around these reactor designs that needs to be dealt with at a national level is the choice of the fuel cycle. And that's what Peter's talking about. Are we going to reprocess? Those that are going with the once through designs are generally arguing that if you bring in reprocessing, you are playing into a proliferation problem. And that's, I agree, Peter, I think it's a red herring, but that's where you tend to get the arguments as to why going with the once through designs, the thermal reactors, the triso fuel. And so what I think we need to be doing is making sure at a policy level, we choose the right fuel cycles that address the very eloquent needs that Peter's putting forward. So I would commend us all through our networks to be lobbying for choosing the right fuel cycles to make these SMRs work for our grandchildren and grandchildren's grandchildren. Thank you, Peter.
Quick comment, Peter?
Yes, I've been thinking about how to get that idea across that we shouldn't go into the other reactors. And there are two examples that I can use. One is that using 0.5% of the fuel is like having a chocolate bar and taking one lick at it and throwing the rest away simply because now it's contaminated with saliva. That's what we're doing in those reactors. And the other one is the concept of, I got from camping. You know that birch bark is a wonderful kindling in any weather. You can even light a fire in the rain. But what we're doing with the with the fuel at the moment in the reactors is like putting a log into the fireplace, burning the birch bark off it, and throwing the rest of the log away simply because now it's charred, and some of the charred has tar in it, and the tar is dangerous if you eat it. It's a stupid way of doing things if we know how to build a better firebox that burns all of it. And so, it's absolutely asinine, and we're going to run out of uranium if we go that way. And if we bury it, it's even worse.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to John Meyer, followed by Anitra Thorok.
Yeah, Peter, thanks very much for this. I'm very much interested in geothermal, which means heat storage, heat distribution, district heating systems, and this kind of thing. My question is, for every kilowatt hour of electricity produced, how much heat energy is produced, and typically at what temperatures with SMRs?
You can have your choice, but basically in general, you might say 2/3 of the energy is lost as heat. And this is why you really want to distribute these reactors and use that heat, because you might say it's free. Right now we're throwing it away if we just use electricity. And the temperature that you get it depends on the type of reactor. The water-cooled reactors are relatively low temperature. A metal-cooled reactor is higher. A salt-cooled reactor is even higher. And but you can take some of the heat at some temperatures and augment it by reheating and getting into temperatures that are really useful for industry. If you just talk district heating, of course, you just need mild temperatures, and any reactor will do for that.
Okay, thanks. The second part, I guess, was, do you have an estimate of cost per kilowatt hour to produce?
It depends. There's over the life of the reactor. I mean, the Russian reactor that was built as a fast neutron reactor at 800 megawatts was built at $3,500 per kilowatt in terms of energy. And if you consider a wind turbine, it costs about $1.3 million per per megawatt. So it's $1,300 per kilowatt, but it's only 30% efficient. So you multiply that by 3 and you get the same cost as a nuclear reactor. I don't know if that helps.
Yep, that's great. Okay, thank you.
And the nuclear reactor works no matter what's happening with the clouds and the time of year.
That's right.
Yeah. So over to Anitra, followed by Zach Jacobson and Barry Bruce, you're going to get one more kick at the can. And at the moment, that's all the questions I have left. We have about 10 minutes remaining.
Thank you for an excellent talk, Peter. This was very illuminating. And I have one comment and two quick questions. The questions are, which nations have the resources besides Russia, Canada, the United States, to do this kind of thing, and where are they going to be recipient of the technology in terms of having the basic fuel? And the second one is, what is your feeling of why the world, if you scaled up, have not followed the path of New Zealand and Iceland in using geothermal, because everybody has a geothermal resource about a mile, in some cases more below them. But my comment is that, of course, in the slide you provided with Otto Hahn and Lisa Meitner doing that, they were seconded along with our glorious past leader of the Club of Rome's father, von Weizsäcker, to do the German atom bomb, which we all know never got off the ground, thank God. But that's just a comment on the side of this entire process.
No, sorry, you said you had two questions.
Yeah, the first question is, if you scale up, who already has the fuel, the nuclear fuel within their country? Everybody, half of them, a third of them? And the second question is, what is your estimate of why countries aren't following New Zealand and Iceland's lead using generous geothermal?
Well, I would say that every country that has a nuclear power at the moment has used fuel, because that is normally stored right near the reactor. And so if you have a reactor, you probably also have used fuel there, which you could reuse or recycle or whatever if you had the wherewithal, or somebody sells it to you. It's not a large proposition to do that. The pyroprocessing, the electrolytic refining, actually is a very small and compact operation. Smaller than the reactor building in a sense. Now, in terms of geothermal, I think it is being tried, and obviously sometimes unsuccessful, because the water that they get out is too corrosive or something. And so I think I'm not a geologist, so I can't really help you as to why it is and why. But not all of the water that's coming out of the ground hot is ready to drink and clean. And so I would imagine if you drill anywhere willy-nilly down deep enough, then you have to worry what kind of water you get out in the process. They can say, well, maybe you keep it inside a tube and just have the heat transfer through the tube and the water will be clean. Well, all of that has to be tried. So, I'm not against it. It's, in the final analysis, I said it's due to uranium anyway.
Right. But it is an alternative. Yes, thank you.
I don't know, because the finances come into it.
Well, I do know that the one huge plant they did build a number of years ago in California really only failed because they overlooked the fact that they needed to get the water back into the ground and eventually ran out of water. Okay, Zach Jacobson, followed by Barry Bruce, and if we have time, Jean Doherty wants to ask a question.
Hi, I'm not going to ask the question I told Dave I would ask because I think Peter answered it really, but I've been worried about Bob Walker's 10,000 unit problem. Yeah, you got to get at least 10,000. 10,000 is just the start. More like hundreds of thousands of small modular reactors to really power the civilization. And as Peter says, if we don't do it, our grandchildren are going to ultimately die if we're not careful. So one of the reasons I thought SMRs were attractive, I don't think I even ever said this to Bob, is that it's a foot in the door. It makes even large things like Pickering, like Bruce, more tractable or more attractive to the people that go, oh my God, it's nuclear. And then there are economies of scale. Have you thought about at all that? Do SMRs plausibly and distributed to a lot of remote communities make the big reactors that we have and already know how to build less objectionable?
Well, I think, tiny reactors in isolated communities are the way to go. And I wouldn't even ask for fast neutron reactors in those situations. But, the major problem is, say, Southern Ontario, where our economy runs on about 70 megawatts of fossil fuel. And our electricity is the cleanest that we've got in the process, but it only delivers about 20 megawatts altogether. To cover those other 70 megawatts by windmills, for instance, requires a farm that goes from Hamilton to Lake Huron and from that line all the way up to Collingwood, solid windmills. I think that's untractable. You can't do that. Whereas the equivalent nuclear reactor in total, if you compare it to Bruce, for instance, requires a 5 by 5 kilometer area to cover all of the energy needs to replace fossil fuels in Ontario. And I think people forget that in saying, yeah, I want to go into windmills. And of course, solar panels cover the land and you can't even use it for agriculture. So I think one has to look at the larger picture. A nuclear reactor of 100 megawatts, which is one of these SMRs, is equivalent to, was it 300, 100, it's 100, yeah, 300 windmills. And the area that those cover is huge, whereas this 100 megawatt reactor, will be less than a kilometer because all of Pickering is a kilometer.
Okay, thank you. Let's get penultimate question from Barry. Please make it quick, and then Jane, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, Peter, fusion reaction seems to be always on the horizon. It's clean, wouldn't seem to be the same kind of security problems, but where do you see fusion reactors in this mix?
Well, I would love to have them, but in the meantime, we haven't got them. And so what do you do? It's as simple as that. In terms of clean, it still emits neutrons, which then have to be stopped by some atoms, and those atoms get activated. And so a lot of the activated atoms are also radioactive. And so you have to shield those anyway. There are some, I don't know how you get the energy out without really neutrons. It's because, electromagnetic rays and so forth. It's a transfer of energy that then matters, which then makes it unclean potentially. But, you know, I'd love to see it. I mean, it's happening in the sun. So, you know, we're taking advantage of it. To do it on Earth is a bit of a challenge, but, you know, I hope eventually we get there. Although, you know, in the uranium way, we've got an ocean full of uranium at 3 parts per billion, which is actually enough to run these fast neutron reactors.
Oh, good. Thank you.
So Jean?
Thank you. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation. My question is sort of along the line of the industry that we would need to actually develop and deploy these nuclear reactors, and the Canadian problem that we've had in the past where we develop this industry and then all of a sudden we decide to get rid of it because this is not, you know, another Avro Arrow kind of situation. So I'm wondering if we've got the capacity in Canada to actually develop this and to make this an industry that we can export around the world. We've got both the minerals, but let's develop this industry. Do you have any feel for how well we are positioned to be able to do this as a country?
Well, I would say that, you know, if Sweden can do it, and they're essentially building a lead-cooled reactor, a fast neutron reactor, and Sweden is smaller, I think, than Ontario, then I don't think we've got a problem at all with respect to that. You know, Canadian capability is terrific. And so all we need is really the political will to say, let's go in that direction. We even have the money. We've got $10 billion socked away, which is for burying the fuel, which we shouldn't bury in the first place. And so that's $10 billion as seed money. That builds, I don't know how many of these small reactors already, and then you can start making money off them and it will snowball. You know, it's, you know, a reactor is not complex. It's a bunch of pipes. No, and we know plumbing. I know plumbing. I mean, I've got a cottage which is water access, so I've got to do a lot of plumbing. You know, so it's not a problem at all. We have the intelligence, and you know, we've exported it. You know, I just sent a book on fast neutron reactors that was developed. You know, the EBR2 in the States by Canadians. One of them was born in Kitchener, the other one was born in Elgin, Saskatchewan. And they're heavily involved with the Argonne National Labs, and they're Canadian. So we have the intelligence, we just have to use it. And we don't have the politicians that have the guts.
Well, on that note,
That's true.
I was just thinking we could end on the high note that we've got the technology, we've got the money, we've got the brains to do this. Let's hope that the politicians hear the message. I just want to share quickly a screen before we go over to Art to wrap this up. And actually, Jean, if you hang around, you're going to get to thank our speaker. So I'd like to thank everybody who was here for engaging in this conversation. Did I get my, yes, okay. It was fascinating, as usual. Want to remind everybody that you're welcome to join the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. It's a registered charity. You will get a tax receipt. You'll find all kinds of interesting information on our website, and you can watch any of our past presentations, over 50 of them now, that are up on our website. So thank you very much, Dr. Ottensmeyer. Over to you, Jean, for another quick thank you.
I just want to say to you, thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic presentation. The opportunities that you've presented to us are wonderful. But personally, I have to say, I really like the idea that you went back to the beginning of time and started to talk about evolution. You're talking to a paleontologist and someone who this was what I did for a living for a long time. And I really appreciate you doing it that way. And in addition to that, your sense of humor and your talking about the absurdity of the situation when you were answering some of the questions, I think was absolutely marvelous. So on behalf of CACOR, Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I would like to thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Okay, Art.
We
you-
have,